Most people think they already know the difference between the God of the Church and the God of the mystics. They think it's a matter of denomination, maybe a question of interpretation. The same basic deity described in slightly different language by slightly different traditions. That's the version you were handed. That's the version that survived centuries of institutional gatekeeping, council votes, and the deliberate erasure of every alternative. But here's what that version left out. There are two fundamentally different concepts of ultimate reality at the center of this conversation. Not two flavors of the same idea, two completely incompatible architectures of what God is, what you are, and what the relationship between those two things could possibly look like. One of them built the religion you inherited. The other one got buried, systematically, deliberately, violently, until a set of ancient jars was uncovered in an Egyptian desert in 1945, and suddenly the buried version had a voice again. This is not a video about which version is nicer. It's not about spiritual preference or personal comfort. It's about what each of these concepts actually claims, what each one requires of you, and why the people in power found one of them so threatening that they couldn't afford to let it survive. Stay with me, because by the time we're done, the God you thought you knew is going to look very different. I'm Daniel, and this is Gnostic Talk. Let's start with the God most people were raised on. Not to attack it, I want to be precise here, but to actually look at what this conception requires you to believe about yourself and your position in the cosmos. The God of mainstream Christianity, the God inherited through the Roman institutional church, is a personal deity, singular, separate, transcendent. He exists above creation. He created the world from outside of it, from nothing, by an act of will. He is omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, and you are not. You are the creature. He is the creator. The distance between those two categories is not a detail, it's the entire architecture. Now, this God has a personality. He gets angry, he grieves, he commands, he rewards and punishes. He can be petitioned, he can be appeased. The proper human response to this God, the liturgically sanctioned response, is submission, worship, and supplication. You approach on your knees, you confess your unworthiness, you ask for things. The relationship is vertical, and the arrow points relentlessly downward from him to you. Here's the thing. The theological name for this model is theism, a personal God who stands outside creation and governs it. And for most of Western history, that model has been so dominant, so thoroughly embedded in culture and language and moral frameworks, that it's been almost invisible as a model. It just looked like reality. But there's a question buried in it that the institution never really wanted you to ask. If God is entirely separate from you, if the divine and the human are categorically different kinds of thing, then what exactly does it mean when the text says, "You were made in the divine image"? What does that image actually contain? And if you carry some reflection of the divine within you, how distant are you really? I spent a long time sitting with that question before I found a tradition that took it seriously. Most of the frameworks I'd encountered either dissolved it into metaphor, you bear God's image in the sense that you have reason and moral capacity, or they doubled down on the separation. The image is tarnished. The gap is unbridgeable without external salvation. Don't look too hard at the likeness. But the Gnostic tradition, specifically the texts recovered at Nag Hammadi, took that question and ran it to its logical conclusion. And where it ended up was somewhere the institutional church found absolutely intolerable. Because if the question is, what is the divine image you carry? The Gnostic answer was not metaphor. It was not a moral analogy. It was an ontological claim. The divine spark within you is not like God. It is God. Fragment, seed, emanation. The language varies by text, but the claim is consistent. Something in you is not separate from the ultimate. Something in you is the ultimate, experiencing itself through limitation. Now here's where it gets cosmically significant. That single shift from you reflect God to you contain God changes everything downstream. It changes what prayer means. It changes what salvation means. It changes what the goal of spiritual life is. And it changes what an institution built around mediating your access to God can actually offer you. Can't exactly put a collection plate in front of someone's internal awakening, just saying. But before we get to the Gnostic alternative, we need to go deeper into the specific theological architecture of what the church God actually is, because the differences only become visible when you understand the full structure of each model. And that means we need to talk about something the Gnostic texts were absolutely obsessed with: the problem of a God who gets angry. Here's something most people raised in any branch of Christianity have never been told. The Gnostic traditions were not simply offering a different theology. They were making a specific, named accusation about the God of the Old Testament. An accusation so radical that even today it sounds almost impossible to say out loud in a religious context. They were saying that God is not the real God, not a lesser interpretation of the real God, not a cultural misunderstanding of the real God, a different entity entirely. A being they called the demiurge, from the Greek word for craftsman or maker, who created the material world but was not himself the ultimate reality. The demiurge in Gnostic cosmology is a powerful but limited being who believes himself to be the highest God, who demands worship, who issues commandments, who punishes and rewards. Before we continue, there's something I want to place in your hands. We've gathered the forgotten texts, the ones the church sealed away for 17 centuries, into a single guide for those who feel the pull towards something deeper. Because whether we speak of the Archons, the demiurge, or the divine spark, one truth remains: this knowledge was never meant to be lost. This is for anyone who senses there's more to this reality than we've been told, and who's ready to remember it. You'll find it in the link in the description below, or you can scan the QR code right here. I'll give you a moment to do that. He is, in their framework, mistaken about his own nature. He is a God with a lowercase g, and he does not know it. The text that lays this out most systematically is the Apocryphon of John, the secret book of John, probably written in the 2nd century CE and found in multiple copies at Nag Hammadi. In that text, the demiurge, called Yaldabaoth, declares, and I want you to hear this directly, "I am a jealous God, and there is no other God beside me." The Apocryphon treats this declaration not as divine truth, but as the demiurge's central delusion. He says there is no God above him precisely because he cannot perceive the monad, the actual ultimate reality, from within the limitations of his own nature. I remember the first time I read that passage. I want to be precise about what happened. I wasn't in some dramatic spiritual setting. I was at my desk at 11 at night with a cup of coffee going cold beside me. And when I read that line, that the God who declares, "I am a jealous God," is being presented as deluded, something went very still inside me. Not because I accepted it immediately, because it names something I had felt as a question for years and never had language for. Why does the God of perfect love need to declare himself jealous? What kind of ultimate reality requires validation? Now, whether you accept the Gnostic metaphysics literally or as mythological framing for a psychological truth, and I'll let you sit with that distinction, the structural argument is serious. It goes like this: a truly unlimited being would have no need to demand worship. A truly all-encompassing reality would have nothing to be jealous of. The emotional register of the God of the Old Testament, the anger, the jealousy, the conditional covenant, looks less like infinite divinity and more like a being operating from insecurity and need. The Gnostics looked at that profile and said, "This is not the top of the chain. This is a governor, a craftsman, an architect with limited blueprints. And the institutional church, from Irenaeus of Lyon writing his famous treatise Against Heresies around 180 CE, to Tertullian, to Epiphanius cataloging heresies in the 4th century, responded to this claim with a ferocity that is itself revealing. When an institution attacks a teaching, not because it's philosophically weak, but because it's destabilizing, you start to wonder what exactly is being protected. Because think about what the demiurge framework actually does to ecclesiastical authority. If the God being mediated through the church's sacraments, the God whose forgiveness requires priestly intermediaries, the God whose commandments require institutional enforcement, if that God is not the ultimate God, then the institution mediating access to him is not the ultimate authority. The entire pyramid loses its apex. That's not a minor theological disagreement. That's an existential threat to the structure of religious power. And the Gnostics weren't just writing abstract philosophy about it. They were building communities, conducting initiations, transmitting texts, and those communities were functioning outside the episcopal hierarchy. No bishops required, no apostolic succession required. The texts themselves, the Pistis Sophia, the Gospel of Philip, the Trimorphic Protonoia, were doing the work that priests were supposed to do. So when Irenaeus called the Gnostics heretics in 180 CE, he wasn't just making a doctrinal point, he was doing triage. And the triage worked. For 1,200 years, most of these texts were inaccessible to anyone outside the circles that burned them. So if the demiurge is the craftsman god, limited, emotional, needing validation, what is above him in the Gnostic architecture? What is the actual ultimate reality that the demiurge cannot perceive and that the church replaced with its personal god of commandments and judgment? The Gnostic answer to that question is the monad. And I need to spend real time here because this is the concept that changes everything. The Apocryphon of John describes the monad in language that is almost paradoxical in its precision. It says, "The monad is a monarchy with nothing above it. It is pure light which no eye can behold." Not a being, not a personality, not a God who wants things from you or issues judgments about your behavior. The monad is the ground of all being, the undivided, uncreated source from which all reality emanates the way light emanates from the sun. Not made, not caused, simply what is at the most fundamental level, before form, before distinction, before the first movement toward multiplicity. Now, here's where most people's inherited categories fail them. The Western theological tradition, shaped almost entirely by the God of the Church, has accustomed us to thinking of ultimate reality as personal. God thinks, God wants, God acts. Even the most abstract philosophical versions of God in Western theology tend to preserve intentionality. God has purposes, God has a plan. The monad has none of that. It is not a mind thinking about you. It is not a will directing the universe toward a goal. It is beyond predication entirely, meaning you cannot accurately say the monad is this or the monad does that, because every statement you make about it limits it by what it excludes. The moment you say the monad is loving, you've implied it is not also something else, and anything that cannot be something else is already not the monad. This is not a Western idea. This is why Christian theologians found it, and still find it, so philosophically disorienting. The closest analog in Western mysticism is the Neoplatonic concept of the One, described by Plotinus in the 3rd century CE. Plotinus argued that ultimate reality is beyond being itself, not a being among beings, not even the highest being, but the ground from which being emerges. The Gnostic monad maps directly onto that framework with one crucial addition. The monad is not just a philosophical abstraction. The Gnostics believed that the light of the monad was literally present inside human beings, enclosed, hidden, waiting to be recognized. The Gospel of Philip, another Nag Hammadi text, puts it this way: "The person who has knowledge of the truth is free. And in Gnostic vocabulary, knowledge doesn't mean intellectual information. Knowledge means direct interior recognition, gnosis. The kind of knowing that happens not when you read about something, but when you encounter it from the inside. I personally think this is the most radically underrated distinction in all of religious history. The difference between knowing about the divine and knowing the divine from within. One of those is what institutions can teach and test and certify. The other is precisely what they cannot touch. And that gap between certified religious knowledge and interior gnosis is where the entire war between the Church and the Gnostics was actually fought. One of the viewers who commented on my video, "I found my pre-birth contract in the secret book of John," wrote something that stopped me cold. They said, and I'm quoting here, "I've been in church my whole life and always felt like the door to God was in the building. This made me wonder if I've been looking in the wrong room." That's exactly it. That's the precise phenomenological difference between the church God and the monad. One of them lives in the building. One of them lives in you. So let's hold both concepts next to each other now, directly, because the contrast is the entire argument. The church God is personal, separate, above. You approach him from below. You petition him. You need intermediaries. Your access to him is conditional and mediated. The monad is impersonal, non-separate, prior to above and below entirely. You don't approach the monad. You can't. You can only recognize that you are already an expression of it, that the divine light the Gnostics described is not something you travel toward, but something you are already carrying, enclosed in matter, obscured by the architecture of a world built by a craftsman who doesn't know he's working from incomplete blueprints. That difference is not a theological footnote. It is the difference between a spiritual life organized around distance and a spiritual life organized around recognition. And as I covered in my video, The Full Story of the Reincarnation Trap, the implications of that difference extend far beyond how you pray. They reach all the way into what happens after you die, and whether the Archons waiting on the other side of that threshold have any real claim on you at all. So let's press directly into the distinction that the Gnostics considered the most dangerous idea they carried. Not dangerous because it was wrong, dangerous because it was right, and because the institution built on top of the church God's authority could not survive it becoming widely understood. The Gnostics did not deny that a creator existed. That's the misreading that gets repeated endlessly, and it flattens everything. What they argued, and what the texts from Nag Hammadi spell out in extraordinary detail, is that the creator of this material world and the ultimate divine source are not the same being, not even close. The ultimate source they called the monad, sometimes the invisible spirit, sometimes the first father. The language shifts across texts, but the concept is consistent. An absolute, self-contained, boundless reality that does not create through intention or craft, but through emanation, through overflow. The Apocryphon of John describes it this way, and I'm paraphrasing here, but precisely. The monad did not create because it lacked anything. It is pure completeness. What came from it came the way light comes from a lamp, not as a decision, but as an inevitability of what it is. And then, through a long chain of emanations, the pleroma, the divine fullness, populated by paired spiritual beings called aeons, something goes wrong. Not catastrophically, not maliciously at first, but consequentially. Sophia, one of the outermost aeons, acts without the consent of her counterpart. She generates something from herself alone. And what she produces, according to the Apocryphon of John, is a being that is imperfect, lion-faced, ignorant of its own origins, and immediately convinced of its own supremacy. That being is the demiurge, the craftsman, the one who looks out at the raw material of a fallen reality and begins to build a world. Here's where it gets cosmically significant. The demiurge is not evil in the cartoonish sense. He's something more unsettling than evil. He's limited. He builds a world based on what he knows, which is not very much. He has no access to the pleroma. He has no knowledge of the monad. And crucially, according to the Apocryphon of John, he declares himself the only God. I am a jealous God, and there is no other God beside me. Not as a lie exactly, but as the sincere belief of a being who has never seen what exists above him. Read that again and let it settle. The declaration of exclusive divinity in the text the Gnostics were working from, the same declaration that anchors centuries of monotheistic authority, is described not as revelation, but as the statement of an ignorant craftsman who mistakes his own ceiling for the sky. That is not a minor theological disagreement. That is a complete inversion of the entire power structure that Orthodox Christianity was being built on top of. And when Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyon, wrote his systematic refutation of Gnostic teachings around 180 CE, this was the specific claim he couldn't leave standing. Because if the God of the Old Testament is not the highest God, if he's a secondary, limited, unknowing craftsman who created a prison world by accident, then the entire chain of authority running from that God through his appointed church to his appointed clergy to you, sitting in the pew, is broken. It's not just questioned, it's severed at the root. I personally think this is the most underrated dimension of the Gnostic suppression. It wasn't primarily about morality or ritual or doctrine, it was about authority, and who had the right to mediate between you and the divine. The church God model requires mediation. The monad model, where the divine is already present inside you as a spark of the original light, makes the mediator structurally unnecessary. Can't exactly put a collection plate in front of someone's internal awakening, just saying. I spent a long evening once sitting with the cosmological sequence in the Apocryphon of John, tracing the chain from the monad down through the emanations of the pleroma, through Sophia's error, through the demiurge's construction of the material world, and into the insertion of the divine spark into the human being. What struck me, and this took a while to fully articulate even to myself, is that the story is not pessimistic. It reads pessimistic at first. A flawed world built by an ignorant creator sounds like a theology of despair. But the structure of the story isn't about how far we've fallen. It's about what we're still carrying despite the fall. The light didn't get left behind. It came with us, into the material, into the body, into the confusion of a world that was never supposed to know it was there. That's the theological move the church God model cannot make. Because in that model, the divine is above, you are below, and the distance between you is permanent and by design, bridgeable only through institutional intercession. In the monad model, the distance is an illusion generated by the demiurge's architecture, and illusions, unlike actual distances, can be seen through. Now here's the piece that took me longest to fully track, and I want to be precise about it because it's easy to misstate, and once it's misstated, it collapses into something that sounds like generic New Age optimism, which is not what this is. The Gnostic texts, specifically the Apocryphon of John, the Gospel of Philip, and the trimorphic Protonoia, do not simply argue that humans are divine. Plenty of traditions say something in that neighborhood. What the Gnostic texts argue is more specific and more structural, that inside each human being there is a pneuma, a spirit spark, that is not of this world's origin. It did not come from the demiurge. It was not breathed in by the craftsman. According to the Apocryphon of John, Sophia's luminous nature, which the demiurge unwittingly absorbed when he emerged from her error, got transmitted into the first human being, and the demiurge didn't even realize he had done it. He thought he was building a vessel. He accidentally installed a light source he had no capacity to perceive. Before we continue, some of what I've learned simply never makes it onto YouTube. That's why I started the Gnostic newsletter, a free newsletter where I go deeper into esoteric Gnostic teachings, hidden wisdom, and the mysteries we don't share in these videos. And when you sign up, you'll receive a Gnostic guide to mastering reality as a welcome gift, completely free. You'll find it through the link in the description below or by scanning the QR code on your screen. I'll give you a moment to do that. The Gospel of Philip puts it in terms that are almost devastating in their precision. It distinguishes between what is born of flesh and what is born of spirit, not as moral categories, but as ontological ones. The person who only knows the world the demiurge built lives entirely within a system designed to keep them unaware of what they carry. The person who achieves gnosis, who has direct interior recognition of the spirit spark, has, in a very real sense, stepped outside the jurisdiction of the craftsman's world while still physically inside it. The Archons come in here, and if you watched my video, you won't be judged after death. The Archons do this instead. You already have the framework. But the short version is this. The Archons are the demiurge's lieutenants, planetary rulers in the language of the texts. They govern the layers of the material cosmos, and their specific function with respect to the human spirit spark is to keep it unrecognized. Not destroyed, they can't destroy it, but confused, distracted, wrapped in what the texts call the counterfeit spirit, the imitation of spiritual life that keeps a person oriented downward toward the material rather than upward toward their actual origin. One viewer left a comment after my reincarnation trap video that I've been thinking about ever since. They wrote, "What broke me was realizing the system isn't designed to trap you. It's designed so that you trap yourself by never asking the right question." I want to sit with that for a second because it's exactly right, and it maps precisely onto what the Gnostic texts describe. The Archons don't drag you back. They arrange the scenery so that you walk back voluntarily without ever knowing you had another option. The counterfeit spirit, as described in the Apocryphon of John, is not darkness. That's critical. It mimics spiritual experience. It produces feelings of religiosity, of connection, of moral elevation, all the signals that in the church-God framework get interpreted as the presence of the divine. And the Gnostics are saying something that requires real steadiness to hear. Those signals in that framework may be the system working as designed. Not God descending to meet you, the architecture generating the experience of God descending so that you stay oriented toward the craftsman and away from the source. I want to be careful here, because I'm not saying religious experience is always deceptive. The Gnostic position is more subtle than that. What the texts argue is that there is a difference between the experience of encountering something external, even something enormous and overwhelming and genuinely awe-producing, and the experience of recognizing something internal. The first is mediated, the second is gnosis. And the whole apparatus of the demiurge's world, including its religious architecture, is built around the first experience, because the second experience produces something the Archons cannot manage, a person who knows what they actually are. Knowing what you actually are, in this framework, changes your relationship to the archonic system entirely. The texts describe this using the language of the soul's ascent, the moment after death when the soul moves through the planetary layers, each governed by an archon, and the archon demands a response, a password almost. And the Gnostic texts provided those responses, not as magic formulas, but as statements of identity. I know where I came from, I know what I carry, and you have no claim on what comes from above you. The Archon steps aside, not because it's intimidated, because it has no jurisdiction over the light. The church God model has no room for this. In that model, there is one God, one judgment, one afterlife structure administered by that God's authority. The archonic layers don't appear in that map because acknowledging them would require acknowledging the demiurge, and acknowledging the demiurge would fracture the entire foundation. So they were removed. Not gradually, systematically, with considerable violence applied to anyone who insisted on keeping them in the picture. I'm Daniel, and this is Gnostic Talk, and this is the part of the conversation I find hardest to keep clinical about, because once you trace the actual historical mechanics of what happened to the Gnostic communities, the word suppression starts to feel like an understatement. Let's start with the texts themselves. Before 1945, the primary sources we had for Gnostic theology were largely the refutations written by their opponents. Irenaeus, Tertullian, Hippolytus, Epiphanius, the heresiologists, the heresy hunters. They quoted Gnostic positions in order to argue against them, which means that for over 1,000 years, the Gnostic tradition existed in Western historical consciousness primarily as a thing being argued against. You knew the tradition through its enemies' descriptions of it, which is like knowing a court case only through the prosecution's closing argument. Then, in December of 1945, a farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Saman was digging near the cliffs of Jabal al-Tarif in Upper Egypt, near the town of Nag Hammadi. He hit a sealed earthenware jar. He broke it open, expecting treasure, and found instead something that would take decades to fully assess. 13 leather-bound papyrus codices containing 52 texts, most of them unknown to modern scholarship, many of them written in the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, some of them drawing on even older sources: the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Apocryphon of John, the Trimorphic Protanoia, the Gospel of Truth. All of it buried, hidden, almost certainly sometime in the 4th century, almost certainly in response to the formal exclusion of Gnostic texts from the emerging canonical framework. Here's what that timing means. In 367 CE, Athanasius of Alexandria, one of the most powerful bishops in the early church, wrote his famous Easter letter, in which he listed for the first time the exact 27 books of what would become the New Testament, and explicitly instructed monks to destroy any texts not on that list. The Nag Hammadi library was almost certainly buried in response to that letter. Someone, somewhere, facing the destruction of everything they had, made the decision to hide it rather than surrender it. They buried it in a jar in the Egyptian desert, and it stayed there for 16 centuries. That's not accidental loss. That's targeted elimination of a theological alternative. And it was effective. So effective that when scholars began translating the Nag Hammadi texts in the 1950s and 60s, what they found repeatedly was not eccentricity, not primitive mythology, but a sophisticated, internally coherent system of thought, developed over generations, refined through real philosophical engagement with Platonic cosmology, Jewish mysticism, and early Christian theology, that had been almost entirely erased from the Western record. The figures who carried this tradition were not fringe cultists. Valentinus, who developed one of the most elaborate and philosophically rigorous forms of Gnostic thought in the 2nd century CE, taught in Rome. He was widely respected. He came within a single vote of being elected Bishop of Rome, which would have made him, effectively, what we would now call the Pope. One vote. If that vote had gone the other way, the Christianity that shaped the next 2,000 years of Western civilization might have been a Valentinian Christianity, one in which the demiurge was acknowledged, the pleroma was mapped, the spirit spark was the central concern of religious life, and the institutional hierarchy was measured against a tradition that considered direct interior knowledge to be the highest religious achievement. That didn't happen. Valentinus lost by one vote, was eventually condemned, and his school, which had been producing intricate, careful theology for generations, was systematically dismantled. Not because his ideas were incoherent, because they were structurally incompatible with the authority model that was consolidating power around the Orthodox bishops. When an institution attacks a teaching not because it's false, but because it's threatening, you're looking at suppressed truth. That's my read. And the evidence here isn't circumstantial. It's documented in the heresiologists' own texts. Irenaeus doesn't argue primarily that the Gnostics are wrong. He argues that they are dangerous. Dangerous to whom, you might ask? Dangerous to the unity of the Church. Dangerous to the authority of the bishops. Dangerous to the laity, who might start making their own theological determinations rather than receiving approved ones. That last concern is the tell, Because a tradition that produces direct interior recognition of the divine, gnosis, real knowing, not mediated belief, is permanently threatening to any structure that positions itself as the necessary intermediary between you and God. The monad doesn't need a bishop. The spirit spark doesn't require ordination to be recognized. And a community of people who know that is a community that cannot be administered in the way the emerging Orthodox Church needed to administer its members. So the texts were burned, the communities were disbanded, the teachers were condemned, and the church God, the singular, supreme, all-administering deity, whose authority flowed downward through an institutional hierarchy to the believer, was the only model left standing. Not because it was the only model that existed, because it was the only model that survived what was done to the others. So if the church God model organizes spiritual life around distance, petition, intercession, mediated access, and the monad model organizes spiritual life around recognition, the next question isn't philosophical, it's practical. What does recognition actually look like? What are you doing differently when you're working from this framework rather than the inherited one? Because this is where I see the most confusion, even among people who have done serious reading in the Gnostic texts. Understanding the cosmology is not gnosis. I want to be precise about that because I made this mistake myself for longer than I'd like to admit. I spent months building a very detailed conceptual map of the Gnostic system. The monad, the pleroma, the aeons, the demiurge, the archons, the spirit spark, the ascent of the soul. I could explain it fluently. I could trace the emanations. I could quote the relevant texts in sequence. And I was doing exactly what the texts warn against, accumulating knowledge about the divine rather than achieving knowledge of it. The Gospel of Philip makes this distinction explicitly. It contrasts those who are in the world and know the world, the people operating entirely within the demiurge's framework, with those who know what lies beyond it. But the knowing it describes is not informational, it's ontological. It's not knowing that you have a spirit spark, it's the spirit spark knowing itself. That's not a distinction. That's the entire difference between the church God system and the monad system, expressed at the most practical level. Here's the analogy that finally cracked it open for me. Imagine you've been told your whole life that you're an orphan. No parents, no origin, no lineage. You believe it because every authority around you confirms it. You've built an entire identity around the absence of that origin. And then someone hands you a document that says you're not an orphan, that you have a lineage, a home, a family that has been looking for you. Now, reading that document and understanding it intellectually is not the same as knowing your family. It's not the same as recognizing your own face in your mother's face, or hearing a voice and realizing you've heard that voice before in some prior layer of yourself. The document is essential, but the document is not the recognition. The recognition is something that happens inside, and it happens not through accumulation of information, but through a shift in what you take yourself to be. That shift is what the Gnostic practices were designed to facilitate, and they were not primarily intellectual exercises. The trimorphic protonoia, which is one of the most striking texts in the Nag Hammadi collection, presents the divine feminine principle, protonoia, first thought, as descending 3 times into the world, each descent corresponding to a different mode of awakening available to the human being. The first descent addresses the pneumatics, those in whom the spirit spark is most activated. The second addresses the psychics, those whose recognition is partial and mediated. The third, the final descent, involves a direct entry into the structures that bind human consciousness and a disruption of those structures from within. What the text describes is not ritual in the conventional sense. It's not petition. It's not prayer directed outward toward an external authority. It's an interior movement, a calling forth, a declaration of origin. an act of remembering that precedes and supersedes the memory structures installed by the demiurge's world. I'll tell you what that felt like when I first sat with it seriously. Not just read it analytically, but sat with it. I was reading a passage in which Protanoia speaks in first person. I am the voice that appears in the silence. And there was a moment where the text stopped being about something external and started being somehow reflexive. Like the voice in the text and something interior were using the same frequency. I want to be precise about that. I'm not describing a vision or an auditory experience. I'm describing a recognition. The difference between reading about an experience and being momentarily inside one. It lasted a few seconds, and then the analytical mind came back and started cataloging it. But for those few seconds, I understood from the inside what the Gnostic teachers meant when they said gnosis is not learned, it's remembered. The monad call, as distinct from prayer, operates in this register. Where prayer says, I am here and you are there, please come toward me. The monad call says, I know what I am, I know where I come from, and the distance between me and the source is not real, it is constructed. That's not arrogance. That's not self-deification in the sense that word usually carries. It's the specific claim the spirit spark makes when it recognizes itself. It's the orphan reading the document and then looking in the mirror and finally seeing the family resemblance they've had their whole life. And the texts are consistent on this. The recognition, when it comes, does not produce grandiosity. It produces something quieter and more durable. The Pistis Sophia describes the awakened pneumatic as someone who moves through the demiurge's world with a lightness that the world cannot account for. Not above it exactly, inside it but not owned by it, carrying something the Archons cannot tax, the craftsman cannot reclaim, and the institutional church god framework was never designed to house. And that's the difference nobody puts in the pamphlet. The church god framework needs you at a distance, needs the gap between the human and the divine to remain unbridgeable by anything other than the institution's approved channels, the sacrament, the ordained priest, the sanctioned prayer. Close that gap on your own terms, through direct interior recognition rather than mediated petition, and suddenly there's no role for the intermediary. Can't exactly put a collection plate in front of someone's internal awakening, just saying. But the monad doesn't need a gap. The monad doesn't need a channel. Because the monad is not located across a distance from you. It's the source condition of what you already are, not what you aspire to be, not what you become after enough moral performance. What you already are, underneath the forgetting the demiurge built into this architecture. Here's where it gets cosmically significant, and I want you to stay with me through this because this is the piece that actually changes the daily texture of what it means to be awake inside this world. Every system built on the church god model is fundamentally a system of debt. You begin in deficit. You sinned, or your ancestors sinned, or simply by virtue of being embodied, you carry a weight that must be paid down over time through the right behaviors, the right beliefs, the right affiliations. Prayer is, structurally, a debt acknowledgement. You are the creature. God is the creditor. The petition says explicitly, I don't have what I need, and you do, and I am asking you to consider my case. The monad framework inverts this completely. You don't begin in deficit, you begin in exile. And exile is not the same as debt. A person in debt owes something. A person in exile belongs somewhere they haven't returned to yet. Those are two completely different relationships to the divine, and they produce two completely different interior lives. Debt produces guilt. Exile produces longing. And longing, in the Gnostic framework, is not a symptom of spiritual failure. It's the signal. It's the monad's own light pulling toward itself through the medium of your hunger for something you cannot name inside the systems that were handed to you. One viewer left a comment under my video on the reincarnation trap, and this one stopped me mid-scroll. They wrote, "I've spent 40 years in church, and the whole time felt like I was missing something that the church kept insisting I already had. Now I wonder if what I was missing was something the church couldn't give me by design." That comment sat with me for a long time, because that's not disillusionment talking, that's recognition. That's someone whose spirit spark refused, for 4 decades, to accept the debt model as the complete account of what they were. Stop, and read that again if you need to. The longing itself is the evidence. Not evidence of your spiritual deficiency, evidence of your origin. This is why the Gnostic traditions that survived, the fragments that slipped through the burning and the banning and the Irenaeus-style campaigns to define them into nothing, this is why those traditions kept insisting that the pneumatic doesn't need to be made divine. The pneumatic is already the divine, already carrying the monad's light in the deepest stratum of what they are, already oriented toward the pleroma by something that operates below the level of conscious religious choice. What the path offers is not transformation from human to divine. It offers recognition. The shift from not knowing to knowing. From exile to a return that starts, not at death, not at some future judgment, but right now, in the interior turn that the church God model was specifically constructed to delay indefinitely. So here's where I leave you. Stop petitioning. Start recognizing. Not because petition is sinful, not because the emotional act of reaching towards something greater than yourself is worthless, but because you were not built to stand at a distance and ask. You were built, and the Apocryphon of John says this in language that still cuts, you were built as a dwelling place for the light that existed before the demiurge drew his first blueprint. The light doesn't need you to petition it. It needs you to remember it's already there. You weren't made to pray to the divine from across an unbridgeable distance. You were made to be the divine, remembering itself. That's the difference they buried. That's the thing the church God framework could not afford for you to know. And now you do. If this video reached something in you that you've been carrying without a name for it, let me know by commenting, "I understood it. I read every one." And if you want to go deeper, the video on the pre-birth contract in the secret book of John is the next thread to pull. Because once you understand what you are, the next question is what you agreed to before you got here. And that one changes everything all over again.